involved. FCOS, absolutely, myself and others are involved in the design of phase 2 as we speak. So things are ramping up, and we're looking to kick that off, as mentioned, from July 2022 onwards. That'll go for 5 years. So it's a fantastic opportunity for organisations who perhaps are not as adept as they could be at humanitarian response to be involved in that space, and to slowly but surely gain capacity over a 5 to 10 year period. And if I look at an organisation like FCOS and DCOS, the Rainbow Pride Foundation, with ILI, Impact Pacific and others, I think it's fair to say, I'm speaking on their behalf, my apologies, but I think it's fair to say that we all feel a lot more confident capacity-wise now than we were at the start of, the end of 2017, come the start of 2018. So in my mind, a great initiative. Of course, there are complications. There's limited funding. We always have limited resources in this space. We appreciate that. But I do think we've come a long way in that 5 year period. And if I look at my career in different parts of the world, I've never seen a funding block of 10 years that's continuous, that allows different organisations from a whole range of levels to engage as comprehensively and as thoroughly as some have. So just a quick background there. Child Fund Australia, the number one comment I've heard since being back on Fiji this time is, Michael, we've never seen your face, but we've heard a lot about Child Fund Australia through FCOS or through DCOS. So here I am, here's my face. Child Fund Australia is a medium-sized international NGO based out of Surrey Hills in Sydney. We have about 40 staff, 50 staff in Sydney, and about 250 staff across the world. In fact, our main focus is not humanitarian response. Our main focus is education, health, social and social learning, focus very clearly on youth, and critically for, say, the children, others in the room, child protection. Very quickly, I'll just show you where we work. Green is where Child Fund Australia directly works, insofar as we have either a country office in those countries or we have a partner. Fiji is a classic case of the latter. We have not got a country office in Fiji, but we, of course, have partners. Of course, DCOS being one of those. The orange is the affiliation through which we work. So you have many child funds. You have Child Fund Australia. You have Child Fund Germany, for example, currently operational in Ukraine. You have WeWorld, which is essentially Child Fund Italy, operational in Moldova, neighbouring Ukraine. We have Child Fund Ethiopia. So whilst Child Fund Australia is not directly involved in humanitarian crises, we are through affiliates or out-of-country offices. Okay, so without further ado, I'll kick off the presentation. And again, the reason I went across from Sydney really is to partake in the workshop, which so far I think has been fantastic. We're having a conversation at lunch around how it's very rare that sit-mill conversations happen. Jenny made it very clear that in a place like South Sudan, where conflict is everywhere, that would never happen. And that really can't happen in the current context. So kudos to everybody for putting their work aside and participating in this kind of forum. But the reason I'm here is to talk about accountability to affected populations. Going back to our conversation at lunch, it was fascinating because our colleague from the Navy mentioned how do you hold anybody accountable, or who holds who accountable within the humanitarian space? Acknowledging that we have donors, we have players like the Navy, the military, the police, the army, FCOS, DCOS, and in the middle, sometimes you've got these INGOs. who, as you saw on the map before, are present in so many countries, yet are not being elected by anybody, at least not democratically, but can come and go upon invitation. So one of the main thoughts that I've taken away from the past day, day and a half, is, as I announced yesterday, and I think quite relevant to us, how does a highly vulnerable affected population hold powerful stakeholders to account, particularly post-disaster? Christine Brack gave a great presentation from ADRA yesterday, trying to explain how that might happen, and some of the mechanisms that you might want to put in place so as to achieve that. And she readily acknowledged yesterday that the power differential between ADRA, or between a child like Australia, or between FCOS and BCOS, and a highly vulnerable person can be significant. So how does that highly vulnerable person who's just been hit over the head with a tropical cyclone going to hold these more powerful organisations to account? And that's why we're here over the next 90 minutes. Another thing that I've heard so often in my sector, in our sector, in the sector that we hold dearly, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of passion in the room for this sector, is this. Josiah, can you please read that for us?
But I had the best of intentions.
I had great intentions. What does that mean? I'm not expecting an answer. And the last one I want to touch upon is a quote. And maybe our friend Yango can read that quote for us.
An individual organisation holding themselves accountable to nobody should not be trusted by anyone.
Something else I've heard in our sector a lot. We aren't accountable. Yeah, but to who are you accountable? For what are you accountable? Especially as a humanitarian organisation, when you fly in, do the job, there for 6 months, then you're out. Nobody ever sees you again. How are you possibly accountable? How can that population ever hold you to account for what you've just done? If you're on the other side of the world now, responding to something very different. What I do want to feed off is what Jenny touched upon. She was talking about, if you remember, a conflict-informed approach to humanitarianism, a needs approach to humanitarianism, and a right-based approach to humanitarianism. Government Australia is a right-based approach, is a right-based organisation. We're not a charity. And I think there is a significant difference between the two when we come to considering how we service the affected population. Many people don't. Child Fund Australia certainly does. And again, just to reiterate what Jenny mentioned, she talked about numerous frameworks that certain governments around the world have signed up to, certain conventions. Specifically, she talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the covenants that come from that. Now, I'm assuming that Fiji has signed up to a lot of those and has contextualized those, so they're appropriate, of course, to Fiji. A very simple thing like the right to water, the right to food, of course, is articulated in these documents. Of those 4 points, people-centred, accountable, minimum standards, advocacy, all great. Today, I'm going to focus on the second one. Accountability. However, I'm not going to explain this or present this in any kind of academic way. I want us to get up and moving a little bit more than what we have been doing. It's been very content heavy, as Bunny mentioned, so try and pull back from that a little bit. I want to start with the notion of power. John touched upon this on day one in the morning. John, can you recall what you mentioned? And if you can you please repeat that? It's after lunch, you probably had no coffee, I realise that. This is quite the stretch. However, give it a shot. I remember it vividly. It was something quite powerful.
Communities were powerless and thinking very actors in this field, we assume that we know what we find out. We have the power of human resources. We don't have the power.
Exactly what you said. Verbatim. John used words yesterday like power, agency, fear, actually. So again, if you're a small community and you're talking to a big, powerful NGO, you're talking to the military, you're talking to EPCOS, DCOS, Impact Pacific, is there the possibility that if you provide feedback, that could be negative, that could be sensitive, that their support to you will be coming? Question. So how do we get to that? On your table, you have blue rectangles. Please pick those up. And we need to make this pretty quick because time to get into this. I want you to think about the context in which you work most often, or very often, as first responders actually, in the communities that we spoke about last night, that John mentioned yesterday, that we referred to in our conversation at lunchtime. Everybody in this room has been, at some point in time, involved, no matter how deeply, in a humanitarian response. So let's put our empathy caps on and place ourselves in that context. Scenario is tropical cyclone comes through. It's 3 or 4 days after that cyclone. And we're going to create a community. We're all part of the same community. A community of approximately 25 people, give or take. On that piece of paper, again, just in 5 minutes, I want you to create a character for yourself, a persona, essentially. On that piece of paper, I want you to give these kinds of details. Sorry? Your name, your age, your sex and gender, your status. Are you married, single, with a partner, widowed, etc.? What is your education? What is your job? How many children do you have? What is your ability? Or are you a person with disability? If so, please identify that. Are you a community leader? Please give me a quick yes or no. Again, just 5 minutes on your blue piece of paper. I've got an example here. This is me. Nice to meet you, everybody. I'm Bob. I am 45. I am male. I have a master's degree. I have 4 children. I do not have a disability. I am a community leader. I am married, and I am an economist. One-word answers are fine. Make it quick. Please be creative. Just because you're a male in real life doesn't mean you have to be a male in this. Just because you're 40 years of age, maybe you want to be 16 all over again. They were good times. Maybe you're a person with a disability. Maybe your gender is different from your sex. Maybe you're an aspirational community leader, but you're not quite there. 2 minutes, please. Again, please be creative. Seconds. Okay, 30 seconds is up, guys. We're going to move into it. I want everybody to stand if you can. Make sure you've got your blue piece of paper in your hand. Sue is our volunteer. Sue, welcome. Please come up the front. So again, the focus of this conversation is around power and critically power disparities. Now, Sue is the representative of an Australian non-government organisation. She lives in Suva. She lives in a tremendous apartment, 3 bedrooms. She has 3 children. Her husband is an Australian engineer. He's a lucky man. He came to Fiji, he found love, and he stayed. Now, Sue has access to a lot of resources. Of course, she is a part of NGO. That's great. Part of Sue's job is to ensure that different communities around Fiji have the money that they need in order to carry out their program. This is one of those communities. What is your community's name? Okay. Read that. Is this one here? This one again. That's great. Okay, so we have a community name, we have community members, we have community members critically with different personas, different characteristics, job, education, age, so on and so forth. We have Bob. Bob, please come forward. That's you. Remember, Bob is this guy, master's degree, 45, 4 children, married.
Yeah, right.
Economist. Bob is going to stand here. Yep. Bob, place that way. Thank you. Our Angel Mazemir from Suva, 3 children, Australian husband, access to resources. Stand here. Bob, a bit closer. Many thanks. Okay, this gap here represents a power gap. Who of these 2 people do you think has more power in this equation? Remember, we're talking about humanitarian response. This is a humanitarian organisation that responds, that provides money. Bob, the community leader, represents his community on behalf of our members. Who's more powerful here? Bob Sue, Bob. No matter what happened. It could be Sue, it could be Bob, depending on the circumstances. Who's more financially powerful? Sue. There's a very good answer to that. Okay. Now, what I want you to do, again, this gap here represents a power disparity between Sue and Bob, and Geo, community. I want you to look at your pieces of paper. We have the entire room here. I want you to place yourself in this room relative to Sue. The further you are, the greater the power gap between Sue and you. The closer you are, obviously, the less the power gap between you and Sue. Bob is your reference point. He's pretty close. So where are you? Again, you're relying upon your blue piece of paper. Read that, make sure you understand it, and place yourself in this room relative to Sue. Again, Bob is your reference point. Community leader, 45, married, 3 children, great education, economist. I'll give you 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes. Do you have more power or do you have less power than Bob? No one's moving. Okay, there's a bit of confusion. So remember, the distance is a critical thing. Distance represents the power gap between Sue from the A and Joe and Bob?
It's a pleasure.
Okay. So for example, if I am Caroline, an example, please listen. I'm Caroline. I've got 2 children. My husband died 3 years ago. I am unemployed and I went to school up until the year of 10. Bob's there, Sue's there. I am going to put myself back here. This distance between Sue and me represents power. Does Bob have more power than me or not? Yes. Absolutely. Okay, remember, I'm Caroline, 2 kids, low education, unemployed, don't have a husband. That's my status. Look at your status. What is the distance that you find yourself from Sue? You've got 2 minutes. Yep. Okay. I think you keep moving around, you're getting further and further away. You'll be out the door in a second. Okay. So we have a nice cross section. We have Googling going on here. Okay, interesting. Oh, movement, not too sure. Getting more powerful. John?
Don't choose a knife.
No.
John, you what? John? Okay, we have people and it's not so powerful people. Sue is not too sure. What do you think? Apparently her husband is somewhere here. He's at the back. He's not very powerful at all. Okay. We have movement again.
You make them confused.
Okay. We have several people with Bob. We have people way back in the corner there. And against the wall. Right. Mr. Lucky, are you all good?
Yeah, you're supposed to go to the
Thanks, Funny. Okay, so we're going to get a few people to read out who they actually are. Fascinating stuff. Misaki, can you please tell us who you are and what some of your key characteristics are?
My name is Andy Boden. 17 years old, female. Widow, didn't finish school. 10 children. Everybody now.
What is your name to us?
Andy.
I need to thank you very much for participating and communicating with people.
I am Kipione, 21 years old. I'm married. So within this call, we have together with however, I'm
It's very interesting. And it's very interesting. Some people perceive this gentleman as being more powerful than what he actually thinks he is. And we think that he should move.
Yeah.
To where?
He's a mouthpiece to deal.
He is an outfit power.
Yes.
I'll be moving right.
No, you.
My name is Young. Very service video, but it is nice for you to do. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we all agree that this person should be back here
Yes.
or closer? Okay, we'll have one more.
Boy. I'm 55 years old, male, single, have a master's, no children. I'm a pilot, but I'm not a community leader.
You're a pilot.
Yes. So I'm standing here, half and half. I can be Whitefield. Can I say Whitefield? I can be used. But I can also be selfish.
Okay, so a rule of the game is you can't be half and half. We think that she should be closer to Sue or not? Maybe just.
Different.
Okay, we're gonna have one more example.
Between Monday, 25, then doing with a partner in economics, then Kopla, okay. Community leader is in the LGBTQ.
Okay, we have many examples there, many really good examples. Again, the reason we're here after lunch is to talk about accountability for better populations. Look at these guys. Very happy with themselves. Very happy with themselves. They're community leaders, they represent the community, that's all great. Can we assume that they represent the community such that we all have access to protection and assistance equally? Remember, we're 3 days after a tropical cyclone has just passed through this community. The person way back in the corner here. We all agree that perhaps he's not as powerful as others, particularly this person here, who's midway, and particularly these 3 people are looking very happy with themselves. Do you think that this person here feels comfortable talking to Sue? By the way, Sue can't speak any local language.
No. Yeah, so this is
Okay, good point. We just have confidence. Do you think this person feels comfortable talking to Sue? Do you?
Yes.
Why? Well educated, pilot. Do you think this person feels comfortable talking to Sue?
Yes, yes, community leader. That's.
Is it community leader at all? Yes. Interestingly, the person who says no doesn't have much power. The person who said yes has a lot of power. Okay. Do you feel comfortable talking to Sue?
Yes.
Why?
So I'm a human rights activist. So I fight for human rights. I'm well versed with all the humanitarian stuff. So, all of the above. Yes, my knowledge is my power.
Do you have a good education?
Yes, I have a bachelor degree in politics and governance.
What's your job?
Activist.
Activist. How old are you?
29,
Are you married?
with a partner,
Kids?
new.
John? Do you feel comfortable? Okay, so I think the picture is pretty clear here. There are certain characteristics of certain people in the community that allow them to feel empowered or not. And the narrative, the conversation around, oh, we can all talk to Sue and influence the way Sue thinks. So as to ensure that Sue is abiding by the core humanitarian standards, to ensure that Sue is accountable to us all equally, is a bit of a myth, perhaps. No, you can't force it, but it's very, very difficult to do because Sue's one person. And we are many in the community across Fiji. So very difficult to achieve. Okay, thank you for your participation. Matt, that was fun. Please take a seat. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Sue. Great job. What will happen is, I don't know, but we are talking about power, and I think history shows that the more power you have, the more chance you have of being heard. The more chance you have of holding somebody else to account. If you're powerless, your opportunities to hold somebody else to account, an organisation to account, are quite limited. So the description you've given, the illustration, is not particularly uncommon. And I'm sure we've all worked in good contexts where that's particularly true. Okay, I'm going to move forward. But before we do, are there any more questions on that? I think it was fairly clear, but it may not be.
Just one to ask. He had a very good
That's someone who is in power but doesn't do it. So that's it.
Well, I suppose in that case, well, I suppose in that case, we didn't have the opportunity to talk amongst ourselves to understand who had more power than anybody else. So if we had had an opportunity, the community, I suppose, would have said, hey, you've got more power than what you realise. Come over here and fulfil your role.
Like he could be sitting in that position.
Yeah, very true. However, it'd be very strange if he rose to that role and status without having done that previously, especially if that role was somehow a chosen role, an elected role, no? Against a fairly small community. Okay, so I'll move ahead. And I wanted to talk about what accountability actually is. So, if you please, I keep doing that, my apologies. Please read our definition. And this is just a definition of Google. I Googled it and it popped up. And I thought that's pretty good.
Accountability means that people or organizations will be held responsible for their actions and for how they perform their duties.
So, at lunchtime, we talked about funding organisations and how funding organisations are more powerful. So, as FCOS, DCOS, Empower Pacific, Chapman Australia, we all have to be accountable to donors. But this conversation is not about that. It's how we hold Sue to account. Because in this equation, in Fiji, we will agree that she has more power. But it's not just Sue and the community. It's Sue, it's Bob, it's the person way back in the corner, the person just here, the pilot, educated, and the 4 people against the wall, for example. How do they hold Sue to account? Very difficult. Let's go there. And accountability is great, but who are we actually accountable to? Now, I'm going to ask yourself to pull yourself out of your personas and bring yourself to real day, everyday life. We have the military here, we have the police here in Pacific, FCOS, DCOS, Rainbow Pride Foundation, so the children, etc., etc., etc. We are here, I think, probably as representatives of our organisations. So to a certain extent, we all hold power. So as organisations, as representatives of those organisations, who are we accountable to? We've already spoken about donors. That's a given. We often use the term beneficiary. Again, Bob's a beneficiary. That person back there is a beneficiary as well. 4 people here, the person here. Is a beneficiary the same as the effective population? I don't expect an answer. I just want you to think about that. Often, we use the terminology stakeholders. So what's a stakeholder? A person who holds a stake. I'll help Masaki with that. A funding organisation is a stakeholder. DCOS is a stakeholder. FCOS is a stakeholder. Is a beneficiary a stakeholder? Has been hit hard by a tropical cyclone, they need assistance, they need protection. Are they stakeholders? No, yes. Tom says yes.
They get whatever is served with this.
They get whatever is dished out to them. They have no influence. Okay. Giving, receiving, influence, no influence. Again, we've spoken about power. Is that think about Sue, think about EFCOS, think about VCOS. Would Sue exist if there were no beneficiaries? Would EFCOS exist if there were no beneficiaries?
No.
Okay, so who's the most important stakeholder in the room? We heard that yesterday, time and time again. It's the people, but we often use this term beneficiaries. And we use it separately from stakeholder. But the most important stakeholder, surely, in the room is the person on the ground who has been affected. Going back to Jenny's conversation, some of us agree that these people have rights. So some of us would think that these stakeholders are the most important stakeholders and they have rights. So I just want you to think about the scenario. If they do actually, if they are viewed by us, primary stakeholders, e.g. the most important stakeholders in the room, and they do have rights, where are we in the equation as representatives of institutions? Because Mataki mentioned that if there are no primary stakeholders, if there are no rights holders, there are no institutions like us or like ours. Again, I want you to think about this in terms of power. So, if some of us agree that they're primary stakeholders, that they're rights holders, again, what are we? Some people would use the term duty bearers. Somebody please take a stab at what that might mean. Would anybody else like to complement what Peter had mentioned? Give us that. We provide service to the local community. However, when we're talking about duty bearers, what are we trying to satisfy? What are we adhering to? Basic needs, yep. Services, yep. Standards, yes. Duty, yes. But we've got primary stakeholders who have, more important than needs they have,
Right.
Rights. They are rights holders. They are rights holders by law, which I think is really important. Now, if you've got a right in legislation, then of course you've got to have somebody who can actually fulfill it and maintain it. But again, going back to the conversation of power and your comment yesterday about Father Christmas, Father Christmas conversation is very different when it's framed in terms of rights. Especially when that person knows what their rights are. Because when we start talking about rights, we start talking about standards. Otherwise, with rights are dangling up here somewhere with no anchor. So, again, some of us may agree that we are duty bearers, but actually, what are they? Now, collective details.
We have obligations or responsibility to respect, realize, and promote human rights, not violate.
At the end of the day, that is what it is. Some fairly fundamental ideas there: respect, realize, and promote. Critically, we've been talking about do no harm a lot under the core humanitarian standard, and actually in several conversations prior to that. So, yes, again, in different terms, we have it here: do not violate, do no harm. If we have right holders and if we have duty bearers, and we argue that there is degrees of accountability, and that we, as duty bearers, are accountable, what are we accountable for? Let's discuss that very quickly. Commitments. We've spoken about those. We spoke about the core humanitarian standard and the 9 commitments. That's one example. We'll go further than that. We've spoken already about staff competency. If your humanitarian organisation does not have competent staff, not great. Sharing information. Remember, person back corner can't speak English. We're distributing information in English. That person wants to know what's going on. Participation feedback, we'll talk about that more. Handling complaints, we'll talk about that more. And finally, learning and continual improvement. So in a very general way, these are some of the things that we are accountable for. If we're not doing these things as per the core humanitarian standard and the 9 commitments, of course, that will most likely come through in our work, and our program quality will not be as high as it possibly could be. I just want to focus on establishing and delivering on commitments. And to give a very clear example. Again, we're talking about power, we're talking about rights, we're talking about duty bearers. Let's have some very clear examples of how those rights are manifest. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says something like, rights holders have the right to vote. It's as general as that. There's something like rights holders have the right to food, rights holders have the right to shelter. But again, what does that mean? Does that mean that I'm entitled to 5 mils of water? Does that mean that I'm entitled to post-disaster a tent? What does that actually mean? There's been a lot of reference to the core humanitarian standard, but also standards that come under that. For those who are very operational on the ground, who are involved in water, sanitation and hygiene, you will know that one of the key indicators, if you're providing the water to an affected population post-disaster, is the fact that the international humanitarian community has agreed that everybody within an affected population is entitled to 15 litres per person per day. You know that as a food security expert, unless you're providing food that covers 5 food groups, you're probably not doing the right thing by the population. And with respect to shelter, if you are setting up a refugee camp and you are not providing 3.5 square metres per person in that camp, you are not meeting a standard which has been agreed upon by the international humanitarian. I remember being in Jordan, working with an organisation that was working with Syrian asylum seekers coming across from Syria, and this UNICEF person, who I thought was incredibly strict at the time, came in and said, "How many litres of water are you providing per day for these people?" We said 7.5. He was like, "There's every chance that your funding might be cut. Please increase volume." So we did. That was the first time that I had spoken to anybody about standards associated with water. It was a massive eye-opener. On top of that, nobody in the community had ever mentioned that to us. They had, you know what? Why nobody in the community told my organisation that the 7.5 litres per day per person we're providing wasn't enough. No, they got it. It wasn't how. They don't know. Yeah, they didn't know. They didn't know that. And do you know why they didn't know? And do you know why nobody told them?
Because they're not aware of their rights.
They're not aware of their rights to decide. Do you know why they're not aware of their rights?
Because nobody told us.
Because I was working with a person who was a water expert who was new to the humanitarian sector. He'd been working in Paris with the water authority there. He had absolutely no idea. So the community didn't know because we didn't know. Because we didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the knowledge. Now, in my mind, and may not be something you agree with, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, that slide, for me, thinking back 7, 8 years ago, was an absolute epiphany. it was an epiphany because I recall studying my master's thinking, these people talk about rights forever. But how do you actually operate like that? And when I opened the core humanitarian standard and the standard associated with these areas, it was like, whoa. Now what I can do is I can link rights, standards, and critically, as a manager, I can budget accurately. Because every person in this camp needs 15 litres per day. And I know the price of a litre of water. It blew me away. Well, we need to budget energy, but it blew me away. So rights are great. But again, as I mentioned before, what is the manifestation of rights for the affected population on the ground? And how does it assist you with your operation? Remember this slide. I want to go to information, participation, feedback, and handling complaints. Remember Bonner's presentation, he touched on the core humanitarian standard, commitments 1 to 9. And he mentioned Michael would talk about commitment 4 and 5. Masaki, do you recall that? We're going there now. So remember, we had Bob, we had Sue, we had a person in the back corner, we had 4 people against the wall, we had this person here, we had this lady here. We had John, father of Bob, thinks he has power, probably doesn't. Works for Bob. And we agreed that it's really difficult for the person in the back corner to exercise power over Sue. Bob probably can, but that person can't. But how do we, as organisations, focusing on that person, bring them into the equation? We've already spoken about information. If that person has no information, how can they possibly ever be a part of the decision-making picture? How can they possibly ever exert power, exert accountability over the super difficult or even bold? Feedback. Person has no voice, there's no feedback. Person has no agency, there's no feedback. No participation, no feedback. These 3 things, information, feedback, meaningful participation, all come together under what a lot of people term community engagement. However, to decompartmentalize these things, I think is also really valuable. Community engagement means different things to different people. Okay. What I want you to do is to work in your, around your table, should I say? And I want you to focus this table on information provision. Again, we represent institutions, organizations that work with rights holders for duty bearers. For 3 minutes, please discuss how your organisations, ensure that rights holders have the information they require. Not DCOS, because as a table, we have the foundation. As a table, please brainstorm. How does this table provide information to right? This table, can you please discuss the same? How do you, as organisations, provide the necessary information to right holders? This table, how do you ensure feedback from the community? Do you pick up the phone and say, hi Bob, what do you recommend? Do you go there? But 3 minutes, please brainstorm. Very good ideas. Guys, need to focus on participation. How do you ensure that the affected population, right holders, participate in decision making? And finally, this table, again, is also participation. So again, you're in the community, how do you ensure that the affected population participate in decision making? Okay, before we go ahead, just to recap, this table is focusing on okay. Information in this table, feedback, this table, meaningful participation, this table. Okay. Now, we are not doing this during so-called peace time. We're doing this scenario 14 days after a tropical cyclone event. 14 days, 2 weeks after a tropical cyclone category 5 event. Remember, you are dealing with right holders. You are dream bearers. What information do they need? What feedback do you require? And how do you get that? And how do you ensure meaningful participation from the affected population? Please, from each group, I need 3 points only. You have 3 minutes. Yeah. 3 minutes, please. 2 minutes now. 3 points only. 3 points only. One more, please. Forty-five seconds. Okay, cover there. I think those tables finished. So he is going to be our scribe. This table here looks everything conversation. Way up, way. Okay. Bunny, is your table ready? You guys want to go first? Again, Saki is scribing. We're going to get it out of the way and then we're going to take a tea break. Okay. Who is representing the table? Cynthia. Okay, sounds good. Josiah, are you scribing? Yep, great. Okay, information is the first one. Cynthia, please take it away. Last person.
Another one is the leadership of the community capacity.
Reflection, integrity, and consent. Connected coordination services. Okay. Of course.
Hey, Mike, we would like to share that in our structure in Fiji right now, we have one more structure, tradition one that the village go through to the government for assistance and anything regarding disaster. The other one is district advisory councils set up. They go through various communities. And the third one is from big posts. That's the way we share our information to all the stakeholders. But the issue here is, like you said, the information. Is it going right to the right people? That is another issue we need to address. Those are the three structures that we're currently working on design. So it's a lot of point of view. Very much the truth.
Thanks very much for the great points. We're dealing with certain stakeholders, but are the primary stakeholders, are the rights holders actually receiving that information? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, perhaps. And even if the community is receiving information, who in the community is receiving it? Is it just Bob? Okay. What we have is a range of different things. A lot of it focused on content and partnership development, which is great. I'm hoping the next table will bring the how. So how to ensure that the affected population, again, we are 14 days post-event. How the affected population can receive the appropriate information. Sue from the ANGO representing.
Okay, how, number one, for today, for cyclone, work with the people on the ground using the community structure, using the community community, maybe the surrounding corridors in the village setting, and community within the community. Doing like community engagement.
Within the structures, great point. Yep.
That was the first point by the to our second point of disseminating information in all our villages. In most of our villages, we have radios. Like because in past cycle meetings, there was battery powered radios in most of the islands that our communities visited for information.
But already.
And the third one, because Fiji is what's going on now, some have backup generators and things installed for social media people taking part in that. Where the information is the government by district offices that are around, they cannot be reached because of
Great, thank you very much. We have the radio, we have social media. I've often heard of SMS being used as well, face-to-face engagement, pre-existing structures, so on and so forth. Thanks very much. Table 3. Who is representing? Interviews. Going to the community. Yes. Face to face.
Just to add on to what this is at the site, go down to the ground for assessment. This is the type for with our strategic partners. So that we work with other government departments that we provide them response.
So working with local students, going down the ground, for example, going out assessments. There's no clear line between any one of these, so who does that? Okay, us, all I'm asking for is 1.1 relating to meaningful participation. Who's the representative? I going over here or am I staying over there? Okay. Guys, please start.
By things down, but there will be really participants. Okay, first of all, we will there and approach the plan corner of in terms of getting identify his junior needs and agree on action plan what you do next, then later on we'll do your monitoring.
Remember this person in the back corner. Are they involved in that? No. Okay, the communities in the community, right? So there's a body, a structure in the community through which responding organisations can move, can work. Guys, there's one point specific to meaningful participation. How do you carry that?
I think using the existing structure within the villages and creating awareness based on the issue, involving everyone through the Turang corridors, going together all the villages and educating them just on the issue on their rights for you engage them, which we will be elaborating on.
Continuing on that point, participation is one of the hardest things to do. So as we discussed, there's probably two types of participation. One is forced or being enforced to do, and the other one is voluntary, which is most difficult. And for that, in the Fijian context of things, there's only about three things that the first Europeans found about Fiji. One is not to touch things about religion. The thing was not to touch things about land. And the other one, you cannot force Fijian to work. That's why they brought intensive living from India. So for in that sense, if you have to win them over in order to participate, you have to actually go down to the grassroots and explain to them what they're able to gain from all this, understanding their rights and once they understand then they will really participate.
Thank you to this table. We had information sharing on these two tables, but not much was mentioned around the entitlements of rights holders. Because if people don't know what they're entitled to, obviously there's going to be miscommunication, there's going to be misunderstanding, there's going to be misinformation, false expectations, so on and so forth. Okay, thank you for all your contributions. Again, there were many things that were repeated here. I won't go into these now, given time, but we still haven't finished the mathematical equation. So before we go to D, hopefully, all of these things will lead to better accountability. Again, great in theory. But don't forget the person in the back corner who can't speak English. Who has zero power relative to the ball. Please think about that while you enjoy your tea. I look forward to having you back in about 15 minutes time. This will be our last session before we wrap up. So please come back with boundless energy. Okay. humanitarian principles to certain organisations those related to the government, those people perhaps cannot be considered humanitarians. Interesting concept. Let's focus on commitment 4 and commitment 5. So, please read out commitment 4.
Humanitarian response is based on communication, participation, and feedback.
Which we've already spoken about. But
Complaints are welcomed and addressed.
okay, so these two commitments very much are dependent upon agency, voice, power. And they encapsulate what I've been talking about quite nicely. To use the same structure as Bonner, I'll just go into standard with regards to commitment 4, and something very dear to our hearts. We said the affected population needs to understand their rights and entitlements, have access to information, and participate in decisions that affect them. We've been there, we've done that, we understand that particularly well. And the indicators associated with that, I'll go through these very quickly. So the affected population know their rights and entitlements, taking on board our conversation. Some people, what's the old saying? Give somebody an inch and they take a. Okay. So managing those expectations, absolutely critical. We then talked about access to clear and relevant information. And to ensure that people are satisfied with the opportunity they have had to influence the decision-making specific to a response. And critically, to ensure that our staff understand the rights and entitlements that supposedly they should be pledging within a response. At least in my experience, that is an extremely rare thing. For staff, particularly new staff, to understand what they should be promoting through community engagement. Commitment 5 goes to complaints and the handling of those. These mechanisms have to be accessible and, well, critically accessible, safe, and responsive. I'll just go through these indicators very quickly. I think this is great because I am a commitment 4 and 5 nerd. I work with Chapman Australia country officers around region to ensure that when they're putting projects together, that they build these mechanisms well. And it is so common for Chapman Australia country officers to say, oh yeah, we'll just use mobile phones. Give them a call. And they can tell us what they think. Again, some people don't have access to phones, so go into the community and ask them, we are trying to design a complaints mechanism. And for the person in the back corner who has the least power, what is most appropriate? Because Bob has a mobile phone, most likely. Others don't. Bring that person into the conversation. The most vulnerable person actually. Start is to ask them. This is the least beautiful part of a project proposal. But I would argue it's the most. Okay, we've talked about accessibility, effective, confidential, and safe. I want to repeat time and time and time again, confidentiality. These are people's lives we're dealing with, and this is their information at the end of the day. And finally, again, it's my experience, but I've been a part of a few organisations where a complaint is made, everyone goes, "Oh yeah, there's always complaints." Too hard. Get it. So yeah, it may be hard. That person may always complain. However, maybe their complaint is quite legitimate. And you won't know until you investigate. And furthermore, if you do not investigate it, the degree of trust, the degree of goodwill between you and that person, your organisation and community goes downhill pretty quickly. I think I'm stating it obvious, and probably you will experience that. So, take it on board, investigate it, try to resolve it, and critically ensure that person that you come back to them. And if you can't, explain why. So I'm sure you've got a very good reason. Okay, we've already covered this really. Feedback can be positive, can be negative, can be neutral, it can be sensitive. I want to briefly touch upon sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. No secrets there. Very sensitive. Confidentiality, absolutely key once again. Again, when you are carrying out community engagement to understand what mechanisms are appropriate, again, ask the question, who are these access for and are they useful? Again, who's most at risk and can those individuals access those mechanisms that you put in place through consultation with them, hopefully? Very basic questions here. I won't go too much into that. I will say this. I reckon, and it's completely anecdotal, and there are some Mill people in this room, so please tell me if I'm shockingly wrong with respect to Fiji. But I reckon that the results of assessments very rarely find their way back to community. Yes. Are you telling me I am right? Many people are saying it's true. Is anybody saying it's not true, John? Thank you, John, brother Bob. So, anybody give me an explanation as to why? True. We all agree with that.
I think it's also because that, you know, we assume that those who work in the development, those who get paid, deliver development interventions, where the government, even NGOs and others, it's assumed that they are the ones who know what's best. And I mean, there's some laws in Fiji that actually say that.
That's like what?
That a particular agency can decide on the interest or responsibility. So there's a bit, I think this is the Native Lands Act that says, what the health care, something that says that they will decide the best interest of the groups.
So we all say yes, this does happen, and I think we all agree that it probably shouldn't happen. Somebody else at the back there, wow, I wonder why. Wow. Wow.
Would it be also, in addition to legislation or regulation that is the limitation that has in place, how about limited resources that we have? Considering the geographical difficulties that we have to reach some of the communities, those are in the outer islands and those are in the highland, because we have limited resources. Going once is okay, and then the second trip is delivering what we think is best for them, but then not much of the thoughts around getting resources towards getting the feedback from the community if those things sit down.
That sounds like an excuse to say.
Yeah, and just saying, like for the current.
Okay, so let's paint a scenario. I come from South Australia. I come from a very small community outside of this place called Adelaide, population about 2 million. The scenario is this. I've got a family of 6 people. A tropical cyclone passes through my community. All of a sudden, this guy called Masaki arrives on my doorstep, says he's from FGOS and wants to carry out an assessment. I'm like, where are you from? He's like, Fiji. I'm like, okay. He tells me my rights, he tells me my entitlements. Great. Carry out the assessment. It's 14 days after the events. Then a food package arrives on my doorstep. We're hungry, we eat it, great. I never see this up again. I'm like, we just gave him all of our information. Where's the information now? Where is Masaki? He's at the door door. He's talking about it. And do you know what he's saying? I have great intentions. So, let's feed back to primary stakeholders. It's their information. And make sure it's disaggregated. Because we all have different needs. As Jenny mentioned, and as okay, we're getting to the nitty-gritty. We've already discussed many of these things. How do we actually do this? We've talked about information sharing, meaningful participation, and feedback. We've spoken about face-to-face. We've spoken about, we haven't spoken about questions desks. They're often useful with communities, especially in disaster. Communities, our representative from here have spoken about their DRR committees, for example. We have spoken about radio shows and SMS as information sharing tools. We've spoken about social media and dedicated web lines and all fixed lines. Again, as I mentioned, play for the community, how you will respond to them, make sure your answers are actionable. Please don't try to dodge any hard questions that come your way. Often you can't reply, that's totally understandable. We're not experts in everything. Make sure you have referral pathways to the appropriate provider of service. And with regards to feedback to the individual, of course, confidentiality and absolutely key to the whole community by those means. And as mentioned, what did I say? But generally, I think. Okay, I'm racing through this. This is something that many people have probably seen. This is an IFRC document that is kind of visible, but it's very big and it takes you through what to do when you receive, again, positive, neutral, negative, and particularly sensitive feedback. Today, when talking about complaints, I really have got into sensitive feedback. That's a whole subject to itself. And I'm hoping that your respective organisations have a mechanism in which you trust, but critically, the stakeholders in which you do trust. So it's basically a go situation. Feedback, can you answer this? Yes, no. I think one thing that's really important is to give ourselves credit. The majority of feedback we have answers for. And quite often the feedback is not given through formal channels. It's not necessary. It's a casual conversation, it's a casual comment, and on the spot, we provide feedback. Great. Sometimes no. Sometimes we cannot provide feedback, if the feedback is sensitive. We talked about SEH very quickly, so on and so forth. Can you answer this internally? No. Can you refer? If so, forward. Now, to give you an example of referrals, Rainbow Foundation, I hope, would support me in saying that the link between the Rainbow Pride Foundation and Empower Pacific has become quite solid through the Australian Humanitarian Partnership, despite the fact that certain calls are not answered, I understand. However, generally speaking, that's a relationship that's improved over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Now, the Rainbow Pride Foundation doesn't necessarily have the skill set that Empower Pacific does. That relationship works really well. Just one very small example. That's everything from me on this topic. Again, despite the fact that accountability to affected populations has been a thing for years and possibly decades, I feel as though it's being pushed to the forefront a touch more now than what it has been in the past. And I'm really pleased that the likes of course, because EDRA, Government Australia, is taking this and trying to run with it a little bit. Thank you for your time and your attention. Questions, please shoot away. Your comment on that, Sue? Thank you. Fine. Okay, so icebreaker time. Everyone on their feet, please. Okay, of course, so during everyone holding their backs, Michael, what are you doing to us? I make no apologies. What I have noticed is that tables have not moved at all over the last 2 days. Please pair up with a person who is not from your table. Seconds, 20 seconds from now. And please find some space with your partner. Paul, do I make? Please find space all the way throughout. And your breath, feel all good. Not at all. So again, I think the spirit of this coming together is very much based around goodwill, partnership, understanding, knowledge exchange, particularly commitment 6, coordination. Bob and I are going to show you how to coordinate. I'm going to lead, he's going to follow. It's a very simple exercise. It requires great concentration on the part of Bob. Okay. I'll take my sandals, so first barefoot. So, his role is simply to follow me. Okay, so you get the picture. So please do that for 1 minute. One person leads, one person follows, then take your right. One person leads, one person follows. Please, before we start, please try to make your movements as smooth as possible. You are not trying to trick the person, you are trying to coordinate with them. Bring the person along with you. Okay, 1 minute, and then change, and 1 minute again. Absolutely right after. Okay, I get the feeling that's something enough already. Okay, take a seat and we'll move into the next section. Thank you. So we're moving very quickly to the end of the workshop. And I'll take that down. Ideally, we'd like to tie a few things together. Bunny, would you mind if you have a pen, just reading out the expectations of the workshop? Not forgetting some of the day one expectations. So we'll just wait for Vane to pull it up. In the meantime, we'll ask our colleague Vitos to rip through some of the expectations that we had from day one.
To understand the role of efforts, the second best way they can synchronize with efforts. And realize respect and humility. The second thing is knowing the role and segregation of relationships, understanding how democracy works. Third one is to understand national legislation, humanitarian assistance, and disaster recovery. Strengthen our network between government agencies, CSO and NGOs, better ourselves to the society. Fourth one is not to talk over each other when understand the different organizations for disaster purpose, understanding the role of efforts in disaster response. Yeah,
so I think we touched on quite a few of those, particularly the role of EFCOS, perhaps. I touched on visibility around the structure of EFCOS and DCOS as a part of EFCOS, obviously. The legislation bit's really interesting. If you think back to the NGO presentation, pretty historic. He gave us a raft of documentation that they reference. Going into all of that could be a real challenge. I was talking to somebody at the press about humanitarian policy and some of the gaps in that, some of the things that very much align with what we've been saying. So maybe that's a bit of a question mark. Which is good. All of this course, CSO policy regulations. I want to touch upon that very briefly, especially for the discipline force members who are with us today. I think there's a bit of a question mark as to some of the standards that the humanitarian community follow going into response, particularly. I'm hoping that has been discussed and it's much more than what it was previously. Understanding that a lot of that is still a challenge for the humanitarian community. A lot of it's quite new, and as the usual, resources are quite thin on the ground for a lot of organisations. What I want to do now is, before we go here, does anybody have any comments, questions around the expected outcomes, whether they have been achieved in their minds, what hasn't been achieved, what needs to be given more emphasis in any follow-up workshop?
Actually, that we've got something that we want the exercise where people have the opportunity to feedback on what they thought went well and what didn't go so well, what we think we should do a little bit more of, maybe something that we can explore for future work. After your exercise, so we don't have evaluation questionnaire, well, it's not safe to do maybe 2 minutes.
Yep, okay. So I'm going to this exercise. In my hand, I've got 3 cards. One is green, one is yellow, and one is. And what we'd like to do, now I just realised, on these expectations, there's a big focus on EFCOS. However, EFCOS is not the only society organisation in the world. It's representative, absolutely, but there are other organisations. And we have been talking about Sydney, Jenny, particularly, of all the presentations emphasised that I thought did particularly well. So one of the challenges, one of the reasons why I think we're here is to improve coordination between civil society and the military and the police, particularly particularly during times of both preparation and response. So I'm going to give each table one of this. And as a table, it'd be good for you to brainstorm, to come up with 3 the synergies you feel exist between the different authors and people study, if in fact there are any. The challenges you feel that exist with regard to coordination between the different groups. Again, focus on question and response. And the value added or the strengths that you feel are the civil society or the forces can bring to this coordination conversation. I'll give you an example. One thing that really came out for me was a comment from you and Bunny's presentation. Bunny's presentation talked about the structure. Remember, we have the National Development Management Council. We had, to the left, if I recall correctly, the cluster system. To the right, we had the 3 task forces. Somebody said, oh yeah, the discipline forces are represented at the NDMC and also within at least 2 of the 3 task forces. And I thought, oh, sorry?
Committee.
And I thought, oh, that's really great. Structurally, there's something going on here. And then my immediate thought was, oh, I wonder if they have conversations on a regular basis and risk planning, exchange, so on and so forth. I don't know the answer to that, but structurally, that's a really great positive. You and I were talking about that at lunch, actually. And I think you mentioned, I realise that. So something you call this. So that's a synergy that I think is pretty apparent. It'd be nice to build on that and identify a few others if there are any. Div-mill challenges. Again, we're here for a reason. Maybe that coordination is not as great as it could be. So I'll leave that with you. And then on top of that, we mentioned strengths, value adds. What I really liked about Jenny's presentation is that of all the presentations, she was the one who articulated roles and responsibilities. She spoke about assets, if you recall. In our conversation at lunchtime, you were talking about assets. We would never have that conversation within society. I've never heard anybody say, oh, we have these assets, which is great. We talk about how intrinsic value that civil society brings is its relationship to communities. We know that police also have a very tight relationship with communities. So what value, what strength are you bringing to this coordination picture? I'll leave these 3 cards on your table.
Michael, can I just add another thing, just to add to some of yes, for Pink, you also add what you think might be useful from the 3 or maybe 4 presentations that you've heard from yesterday to today. Things that you might have learned from Michael and Jenny and Bona and maybe even me and then Diego. Things that you'd like to be added to what you're doing right now. You know, in a way that helps to your sort of mandate during the process. Yeah, that's the as well.
And one thing I would mention is yesterday we were talking about operating procedures. You mentioned that the Army has nothing to hide. Great example of synergy, value add. I was quite taken aback by that. I was like, oh, these things are available. These critical documents that no doubt aid in coordination are available. Right. Okay. Are there any questions before we move on? With Mrs. Philip, I'll put these cards on each table. Have a think about the task. Again, at that point, if you have any questions, please raise them, we'll go through them and.
Can I make a suggestion that civil society sit together? Did you already make that?
I didn't.
Okay. Can I make a suggestion that we sit together with society? You know your system well, so you know how to apply some of this.
Do you want military and police?
Yeah. Well,
Together?
I feel very strongly that we should do that together.
You want us to go what?
What do you think unless you have an alternative plan for how we do it?
I suggest one thing. Can I suggest that we start in our respective groups and then we do a quick exchange to add to it if we feel that's necessary or if we feel that's going to add up to the process. Okay. Oh, we can do that. Let's start in our respective groups. Again, civil society, police, and military, and then we'll change it up. And we'll use that as a verification. Hey guys, this is not a 2-minute exercise. You've got 15 minutes to be able to get through this. And after that, again, we'll do a quick exchange for about 10 minutes. And then we'll call it on this.
We're done.
Let's try and finish at 5 p.m. It's been a long day, it's been a long 2 days. So again, simple instruction, please each table identify one person who will represent on the table sheet card. That person is to present just 2 points from each of their 3 cards. Again, it is 2 points from each of the 3 cards, total 6 points. So please identify representative, please identify your points, and then we'll take it from there. This table to go first, if you don't mind. This table second. This table third, and this table can be last.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, for our group, we a group of CSO, and then validated by representative from this table. The 2 challenges that I'll speak on, one is data. When we're speaking about data, one is availability of data, and some data that are available, how to access it. That's quite a challenge. And sometimes accessible, but then lack of credible data. Some are outdated data, and some we need additional information. And the second one is around relationship management. We've been building relationship, we've been having partnership, but how do we manage that? How do we sustain the relationship that we build? And most of the time comes about trust issues within institutions and also between the community and actors. So that's the 2 challenges that I'd like to share. There are 2 more, but in terms
Before you go there, the data, what kind of data are we talking about?
Community data, and in terms of response as well, the needs of the community, how are we capturing these needs of the community? Sometimes we access the data, but then there's not enough data for us to put together a proposal for our donors, because that's what most of the donors ask us in terms of the desegregated data, gender, and needs of persons with disability. We know that these numbers of persons with disability, but what are their real needs that we can capture in a proposal? What's working? It's not perfect, but something that has been working. One is partnership. In the last, I think it's safe, in the last 24 months, 2 years, most of us have been able to build relationship and partnership, not only between CSO and government, but among ourselves as CSOs, and this has helped our work, but there's always room for improvement on that. Second one is around capacity building and dialogue. We're able to work together in terms of building capacity of, this came out of the inclusion and the protection clusters. How do we build capacity of other organizations who are going into the community to learn more about the inclusion bit of our humanitarian work? And more to that is dialogue. We can see that there are more dialogues that are happening at the national level and also at the subnational and community level, that actors and stakeholders are coming together to talk more about the need that arises from the community. Value added from after these 2 days, understanding the existing structure. Most of the time we think that there's only one structure, so most of the time we care to see these structures as competing, but now we realize that there are different structures that can work well, and those structures are the VANOA, or the traditional structure of the community, the government, and also the CSO or the CBO structure. And secondly, the possibility of giving, of course, a legal mandate. We are mandated under the Act. However, the CSO feels that the group that were part of the discussion felt that we need a little bit of some sort of a little bit more strength or more of like a little bit of teeth for us to operate well. I don't know what was meant by that, but possibility of a legal mandate, and that mentioned in the bill is not enough. We can bring that down to policy level or more of like at the operational level when it comes to systems and stuff. That's
Thank you, who was table two? Okay, I would ask table two to present their 2 points from each card relevant to civic members' ordination. Please, table two.
You added, as mentioned, because we have flexibility and cashless. Flexibility. And some of the challenge we have here is the lack of resources and funding. What can I do?
And there was one more. Cities, challenges, and oh. I think it's pretty. No. Pretty well. Okay, we're going to do
It's always critical. But the democratic will be ground. Okay, so the challenge that came out from our colleagues was that they couldn't work with systems they had to go through anything else. So this is because of manufacturing here. That's the challenge, and also some confidentiality issues. They felt that at times we need, or say so, I want to be open in terms of individual information to be free and accessible. And the review they can well, from their end, it's need-based, so they will give us the information according to. So for us, we appreciate that. We understand where we're coming from because they only follow a structure. They have a set of structure as opposed to us. That's the challenge. In terms of energy, understanding the role of the groups is to gather after the workshop. This is very important because most of the time they do not have access to this instrument. And this, at times, this is the only time they get to have sit with us at the table in workshops. And from this particular workshop and many other kinds of workshops, they are able to understand our roles and our responsibilities. Yes, in terms of the synergies, one thing that came out strongly from them is partnership, how to collaborate, complementing each other's work. So then we added from this workshop, networking to understand the gaps, understanding that we have so and the military in this space, understanding, recognizing, and complementing. You know, really recognizing there are gaps and working towards closing that gap. And also willingness to accept what we give and what they already give. But in other words, we are appreciative of the fact that we're in this space, being able to have that uncomfortable conversations and dialogue, well appreciated and loved by them.
Very well spoken, thanks so much for that. And the last table, I understand there are two presentations. Yes. So, what? Okay. Who's taking it away?
So in terms of what's working well with the police, the SOPs that are in place. In terms of what's working already after 2 days of presentation. The things that they recognize was the preparation. I think a lot of the stuff that they find is already working well is around their preparations or their preparedness. So they have SOPs, they undertake the operational readiness check, they do audits, they participate in a lot of the tabletop exercises, and I'm glad that they also listed down that they've already included EOC trainings, so that's great. Their challenges is around, they recognize that they need to strengthen their partnership with communities. And, and then it links to the second point that they have listed here with regards to challenges, is they listed it as inconsistency. So when we asked them what that meant, they said, the competency for community engagement, giving, some of their officers is not really there. So great that they want to strengthen their partnership, also identify succession planning, common complaint across government agencies, budget allocation. Already never had that. So, yeah, so the challenges in terms of the value add, they recognize now that they need to learn a little bit more about humanitarian standards. They also want to, they now understand that while there's some data gaps between what they have and what Ministry of Rural Development or the commissioners have, is because the data that the commissioners often have because of the applying to that. Sometimes they don't have a full data, so they want to also see how they can do that, of course. So, and also around price. they will do a presentation, I think, back to their leaders to identify some of the learnings here, and they want to emphasize that they might want to do some investigating around rights, which is linked to the standards.
For one of the points that is sharing of information, and the other point is this. The phase, we have the biggest topic that rural development is is a channel of communication. With that in mind, it's important, I would say, the communication. The communication has been needed by the rural is not affected by NGOs. They tend to go direct to the ground, and there's a risk of double. It's not a unique challenge. And for community focal point, the core, the maternity, all these included in
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Ronnie. And I will take the word and phrase insubordination and doubling away with them. Strong, strong words. Okay. We are at time, probably beyond time actually. So I'll let Bunny wrap it up. Before I do that, again, I can say a big thank you on behalf of Child Life Australia for your participation and your attention, and particularly to EFCOS and DECOS for inviting me. I was saying to somebody during lunch, I think I haven't been in Fiji for two and a half years because of COVID-19. I usually come every 4 to 6 months, so it's been an absolute thrill, actually, for me to be able to jump on a plane, pop across to Fiji, catch up with many, many, many faces. People I really enjoy working with. So again, thank you for to them, and also great to meet so many new faces. Buddy, you want to take the mic?
Yeah.
Thank you. Once again, thank you. Sir, Mr. Michael, on behalf of the workshop participants that are present and around you, I would like to take the time and thank you once again for the great presentations that you've presented so far. We indeed have learned a lot from our past mistakes and what we've been doing wrong. Within the course of this 2 days workshop, I myself, a police officer, I get to see the mistakes that I've made in the past and the preconceived ideas that I've had for all these CSOs and all these NGOs that are seated before me. I've always been very discriminate about the words if they get criticized us more. This workshop, sir, I can say that I have a very wonderful footing and I still have a long way to go in order to filter well and work well with the rest of the other digital partners that we have. Once again, sir, Naka and Naksarvali, and I would like to ask my colleagues to put their hands together. Thank you.
Okay, just as we are about to close up, I just have one, I think you've been distributed with a piece of paper. And I thought maybe as a last activity, you can sit together and just give us some feedback. We've been talking about feedback for one whole day. And we're giving you the opportunity to tell us what we did okay and what we didn't do quite well this workshop. So if you can sit in your groups and let us know, how things can be better. And as you do that, I'm going to ask us to stand up and just stretch. And then we're going to form a circle. Yeah, and we're going to close the so stretch, and you can form a circle, and yeah, feel free to go to town with your feedback on that yellow piece of paper. We're very open to learning from that. You can close the circle, and Adra and Christine said closing the
Feedback loop. Boy.
Closing the loop. Closing the loop. Yeah? Right. Then I'm gonna practice my ground. You can't say a sentence. You can only say one word. One word that sums up how you're feeling right now after 2 days of intense discussions around standards and disaster resilience, disaster readiness. I think we talked about that too. Just one word to sum up how you're feeling right now after having gone through 2 days of that discussion. I'm going to pass.
One word, one sentence. So tell me a story. You can tell me at the conversation.
Finally,
Wow.
I'm proud.
Excited. Happy.
Enlightened.
Thank you.
Relieved. Thank you for joining us on 2 days of response on standards. Standards not an easy conversation, particularly as we've always approached this from us and them perspective. As Michael also clearly articulated to us today through his 1 hour, 2 hours presentation, that it is all about people. Yeah, people. Right hold, right? So I'm really thankful for your willingness to join us. Oftentimes we get a lot of reluctance when we try to engage with our colleagues from the discipline forces and even from the civil service, and that's understandable given the amount of work that you handle and with the limited resources that you have. But we want to show our appreciation to you for joining us and taking this journey with us. We hope that it will continue, that it's not at the end of it, but a beginning, I guess. And in future response operations, that we are not taking from in a room across from each other saying, we're gonna do this and you're gonna do that, but we're looking at how we collaborating and coordinating to do the best. So with that said, I'm gonna ask us to perhaps here you can tune a song or chorus before someone can come. And then get the Lord to sing. Gonna ask our colleague to do we want to yes.
In fact, let's think of today and what we'll pray. Thank you for our lives. I want to thank you for the lives of our instructors, our teachers, our fellow colleagues, and our families. Thank you very much for all that you've done for us. Thank you for dying on the cross for our sins. We ask that you forgive us for our trespassing. Forgive us for every wrongdoing we've been going through with our lives in the past. We ask that you bless the team from Air Force, our good friend from Australia, on his stay in Fiji, on his trip back home to meet up with his family. We ask that you bless each and every one of us. Give us today what our daily bread, and we pray all this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
About collectively, and if you so log out, check out is tomorrow.
Wow.
Please,